My name is Victoria Lane, and I will never forget the night when a single careless sentence cracked open years of quiet work and buried dreams. The rooftop party shimmered under 1,000 fairy lights, a soft summer wind carrying the scent of jasmine and expensive champagne. But all I felt was a tight coil in my chest as my father led me toward the microphone. The crowd turned expectantly when he cleared his throat, his smile wide and confident. "This is my daughter," he said, pausing just long enough for suspense. "She's unemployed." A ripple of polite laughter spread through the guests like a wave, glasses clinking, someone even whistling as though it were all in good fun. I smiled, because what else could I do? But inside, every syllable hit like a slap. He thought it was a harmless joke, a playful jab, but to me, it was a reminder of every late night when I'd worked in secret, every time I had hidden my plans because I knew he wouldn't believe in them. My company existed in the shadows, by choice. Its early victories quiet and deliberate, and he had no idea that the very air around him that evening was humming with the song I owned. I stood beside him while the DJ's music thumped in the background, the bass line vibrating through the wooden deck, and I felt my heart keep time with the beat. Then, through the chatter and the clinking glasses, I heard 3 soft notes that only I could recognize. My breath caught. That melody had once played through tinny laptop speakers in my tiny apartment, when the idea for my business was nothing more than scribbles on a whiteboard. Now it was a nationwide jingle attached to contracts, clients, and a brand that had quietly grown far beyond my father's imagination. I watched the DJ's hand hover over the controls, his head bobbing as he let the track unfold, and my pulse surged with the music. The sound rose and wrapped itself around the crowd, subtle at first, then undeniable. Conversations faltered. A woman near the bar tilted her head and whispered to her friend. Another guest snapped his fingers in recognition. And then, like a spark catching dry grass, the realization spread. Faces turned toward the speakers, toward me, toward the man who had just introduced his daughter as if she had nothing to show for her life. My father's laughter faded as he frowned, eyes narrowing, a faint line of confusion pulling at his forehead. He knew that sound. He had heard it on television ads, in shopping malls, maybe even in the car radio during his commute. But he had never known it belonged to me. I felt a slow, dangerous smile rise to my lips as the chorus bloomed into the night, each note a declaration of independence, each beat a reminder that the world beyond his judgment had already embraced what he dismissed. For once, he had nothing to say. I turned to him, meeting his gaze without a single word, letting the music tell the story I had kept hidden for so long. Around us, the crowd swayed, clapping to the rhythm, their voices lifting in recognition of the brand that bore my vision. It was more than revenge. It was revelation. Yet even as triumph coursed through me, I knew this moment was only the surface of a much deeper journey. To understand why this single song mattered so much, you would have to go back with me, back to the quiet years of doubt, to the lonely battles and the small victories no one noticed, to the girl my father never thought would rise. Only then can you see how a so-called unemployed daughter built the music that now played like a heartbeat across the night. Before the music and the rooftop lights, there was silence. And silence can be the cruelest sound of all. I grew up in a house where love was measured by accomplishments you could hang on a wall, and where my quiet victories dissolved in the shadow of louder expectations. My name is Victoria Lane, but as a child, I often felt more like a faint outline than a person. At family dinners, my father's voice filled every corner of the room, while mine slipped beneath the clatter of plates. He loved to talk about numbers, sales figures, profit margins, promotions earned by colleagues' children, while my own achievements landed like a dull thud no one heard. When I brought home an art project that won first prize, he nodded absently and asked if I considered accounting. When I aced a science fair with a handmade prototype, he reminded me that real jobs required real discipline. My mother, gentle but cautious, would offer a small smile and a plate of food, her silence a quiet plea not to rock the boat. Each dismissal etched a line of determination inside me, though I didn't yet have words for it. At school, I learned to disappear in plain sight. I sat in the back of classrooms, absorbing every lesson while pretending not to care about the praise I secretly craved. Teachers called me capable. Classmates called me shy. I called myself nothing at all because naming ambition in that house felt dangerous. Even my triumphs, winning debate finals, designing a website for the yearbook committee, were brushed aside as hobbies, distractions from the serious path my father envisioned. He wanted a doctor, a lawyer, an executive with a corner office and a predictable salary. I wanted something I couldn't yet explain, a life that hummed with creation instead of caution. Late at night, I would sit by my bedroom window, sketchbook balanced on my knees, listening to the distant city sounds and imagining a future no one else could see. I built worlds in secret. Tiny logos, imaginary jingles, business plans scribbled in the margins of school notebooks. I didn't know then that these scraps of imagination were blueprints for the company I would one day build. All I knew was that the more my father ignored me, the more fiercely I wanted to prove that I mattered. His words became the quiet fuel for my resolve, each sharp comment another spark against the steel of my ambition. There were moments, of course, when doubt crept in like a slow leak. I would watch my peers collecting college acceptance letters and internships while I sat with the sketch pad full of dreams too fragile to share. But even in my darkest hours, a small voice whispered that invisibility could be an advantage. No one expects greatness from a girl they barely notice. And in that anonymity, I found freedom to experiment, to fail, to learn without the crushing weight of judgment. By the time I reached my final year of high school, I had grown used to being underestimated. I wore their low expectations like a cloak, hiding the quiet power beneath it. Looking back now, I see that every ignored drawing, every overlooked idea was a rehearsal for the night when my father would stand before a crowd and call me unemployed. He thought he was making a joke. He didn't realize he was setting the stage for my debut. There comes a moment when silence hardens into resolve. And for me, that moment arrived on a rainy Thursday night that smelled of wet asphalt and stale coffee. I was 19, standing in our dimly lit kitchen while my father recited, yet again, his list of acceptable futures. Medical school, law school, finance, he said, ticking them off like a grocery list while the rain hammered the windows. My name is Victoria Lane, and I can still hear the soft hiss of the kettle behind his words, the way the steam curled upward like a question I could no longer answer. He wanted me to choose security. I wanted to choose myself. That night, I finally understood that pleasing him meant erasing the wild, creative pulse that made me who I was. When he dismissed my quiet protests with a chuckle, "Dreams don't pay bills, Victoria," something inside me snapped. I felt the room tilt as if gravity had shifted, and I realized I could either stay small enough to fit his expectations or step into a life that terrified me with its freedom. My decision was sudden but absolute. I packed a single duffel bag with sketchbooks, a worn laptop, and enough clothes for a weekend, though I knew I wasn't coming back anytime soon. My mother watched silently from the hallway, her eyes glistening with a mixture of fear and pride. She pressed a folded $50 bill into my palm and whispered, "Be careful," a blessing hidden inside a warning. I left before dawn, the house asleep except for the creak of the front door and the echo of my own heartbeat. The city beyond our quiet suburbs smelled of possibility. Damp concrete, hot pretzels from a street vendor setting up early, the faint metallic tang of risk. I rented the smallest studio I could find, a space barely larger than my childhood bedroom, where the radiator hissed like a living creature, and the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbor's alarm clock every morning. But for the first time, the air belonged entirely to me. I worked meaningless part-time jobs, stocking shelves, delivering takeout, while devouring every free online course I could find on design, branding, and digital marketing. Each shift was exhausting, but every hour brought me closer to a vision that had finally found its name, my own company. Nights blurred into mornings as I sketched logos under flickering fluorescent lights, my fingers stiff from cold and caffeine. There were setbacks, of course, clients who promised payments and disappeared, concepts that fell flat, bank accounts that wavered dangerously close to empty. But each failure felt like a bruise earned in training, a necessary ache on the road to independence. I learned to pitch ideas with trembling hands, to negotiate contracts while my voice quivered but never broke. Friends drifted away, unable to understand why I chose exhaustion over easy fun, but I no longer needed their approval. I was building something invisible, a foundation no one could mock because no one yet knew it existed. Looking back, that tiny studio was my crucible. The radiator's hiss became my metronome, marking the steady rhythm of late-night breakthroughs. I arrived there as the overlooked daughter of a man who couldn't imagine a world beyond his narrow ambitions. I left as a woman who had carved her own path, battle-scarred but unbroken, ready for the next challenge. The night I finally signed the paperwork for my first paying client, I stood by the cracked window, listening to the city hum below, and whispered to myself, "This is only the beginning." My father believed I had disappeared into failure. He had no idea I was quietly building the empire that would one day echo through the speakers of his perfect party. The first paying client felt less like a victory and more like a flicker of light in a room I'd been groping through for years. My name is Victoria Lane, and I can still taste the metallic tang of nerves from that morning. The air smelt faintly of printer ink and overbrewed coffee in the co-working space where I pitched my fledgling branding service. The client, a small startup cafe desperate to stand out on a crowded street, sat across the scuffed bagel with guarded eyes. My presentation was cobbled together from sleepless nights and borrowed design software, a patchwork of instinct and ambition. As I clicked through each slide, my heartbeat pounded louder than the ceiling fan above us. When I finished, silence stretched like a taut wire. Then the cafe owner exhaled, smiled, and said, "Let's do it." Those 3 words detonated in my chest. They weren't just a contract, they were proof that the universe had heard me whispering into the void. I walked home through a drizzle that glazed the sidewalks in silver, replaying the moment on a loop. That small cafe job became my laboratory. I worked 14-hour days creating a brand identity that smelled of roasted beans and warm memory, designing a logo that looked as if sunlight itself had brewed it. When the grand opening drew a crowd larger than the owner ever expected, I knew I had found something more than work. I had found a pulse that matched my own. With each successful project, referrals trickled in like shy guests at a party, and soon my inbox hummed with inquiries I once only dreamed of. Still, every achievement carried a shadow. My father remained silent, unaware of the quiet empire forming beneath his radar. Phone calls home were brief and mechanical. "How's the job hunt?" he would ask, his voice laced with the assumption that I remained adrift. I answered with vague phrases, "Keeping busy, learning a lot." Each one a small act of camouflage. Behind the curtain of secrecy, my small studio apartment transformed into a nerve center of ambition. Sticky notes mapped the walls like constellations, client timelines, design sketches, jingle drafts. Nights were fueled by instant noodles and the hum of my aging laptop. I learned to celebrate tiny victories, a client payment clearing on time, a social media post going viral, a stranger complimenting a logo they didn't know I'd created. Those micro wins stacked quietly until they formed a mountain high enough to climb. One particularly sleepless week, I composed a short audio jingle for a boutique clothing brand. A playful, catchy melody that stuck in my head like sunlight on a rainy day. When the brand reported a surge in foot traffic after launching the tune, I realized audio could be as powerful as visuals. That insight would later become the heartbeat of my company. Yet, success carried its own kind of loneliness. Friends from college posted photos of vacations and promotions while I buried myself in deadlines and invoices. But whenever doubt crept in, I thought of the cafe owner's words, "Let's do it," and pressed forward. Each new project sharpened my instincts, teaching me when to push and when to pivot. Slowly, the abstract dream of owning a creative agency began to harden into a real breathing business. The paperwork for my LLC sat on my desk like a sealed promise, waiting for the moment I would finally sign it. I stared at it for weeks, afraid to jinx the fragile momentum. The night I finally slid the signed documents into a manila envelope, the city outside seemed to pause. Streetlights flickered, rain hissed against the glass, and the radiator whispered like an old friend. I wasn't just freelancing anymore. I had built a company. Small, scrappy, but undeniably mine. Somewhere across town, my father probably slept soundly, convinced his unemployed daughter was still chasing fairy tales. He had no idea that the melody destined to echo through his perfect party had already been born in this cramped apartment, waiting for the right moment to make him hear it. Some ideas arrive like a lightning strike, blinding, sudden, impossible to ignore. Mine began on a fog-soft morning when the city still yawned awake. I'd been pacing my studio apartment, wrestling with a stubborn design brief, when a half-forgotten melody drifted from a neighbor's radio, a snatch of a childhood cartoon theme. It snapped something awake in me. My name is Victoria Lane, and that moment was when the heartbeat of my future company finally found its rhythm. I grabbed my keyboard and began experimenting, layering playful notes over a subtle bass line until a sound emerged that felt both nostalgic and new. The melody carried the warmth of a memory and the thrill of discovery, exactly the emotional spark brands were desperate to capture. At first, it was just a side project, a creative release from client deadlines. But one evening, while testing the jingle against a rough animation, I felt the room change. The radiator hissed in perfect tempo. The city traffic outside became a percussion track, and suddenly, the music wasn't just a tune, it was an identity. I stayed up until dawn, recording, editing, and refining until the melody pulsed with a life of its own. By sunrise, I knew I had something marketable, something powerful enough to build an entire agency around. Opportunity knocked faster than I expected. A mid-sized beverage company I'd pitched months earlier called to say they wanted a sonic rebrand. Their marketing director was tired of bland elevator music and wanted a sound people can't forget. I offered my jingle demo almost on impulse, my voice trembling as I hit play during the Zoom call. For 30 seconds, the conference room on the other end was silent. Then came the words I will never forget. That's it. That's our sound. Contracts followed within days. The deal wasn't just lucrative, it was transformative. For the first time, I wasn't merely designing visuals, I was creating an experience that could infiltrate homes, cars, and earbuds. The launch campaign rolled out like a tidal wave. Commercials, social media reels, even pop-up events, all pulsing with my melody. Each time I heard the jingle in a grocery store or through a stranger's headphones on the subway, a quiet thrill rippled through me. The The world was unknowingly humming a tune born in a cramped apartment where I once doubted every decision. Still, I kept my success a guarded secret, fearful that sharing it too soon would somehow break the spell. Even as invoices cleared and my business account swelled, my father remained convinced I was unemployed. His weekly check-ins carried the same dismissive edge of, "Have you sent out any real job applications?" I answered with careful half-truths, savoring the irony. Behind the scenes, the company I founded, Heart Lane Creative, expanded from a one-woman operation to a small but relentless team. We rented a modest office downtown where the smell of fresh paint mingled with the buzz of late-night brainstorming. Every pitch meeting, every new contract felt like laying another brick in a fortress only I knew existed. But the bigger the fortress grew, the harder it became to keep hidden. One night, while reviewing final edits for a national commercial featuring my jingle, I caught a glimpse of the broadcast schedule. A major release was timed to coincide with an upcoming charity gala hosted by none other than my father's business circle. My chest tightened as the pieces locked into place. The very song he would unknowingly dismiss as background noise was about to introduce itself in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. I stared at the glowing monitor, a smile creeping across my face. Fate had composed its own crescendo. Soon, at a glittery party where I was still expected to stand politely on the sidelines, the music would speak for me. My father's favorite DJ was already booked. All that remained was to let the melody play and watch the truth unfold in every beat. The official envelope arrived on a bright Friday morning, thick ivory paper edged in silver like a secret waiting to be opened. I turned it over in my hands, the embossed crests of the country club catching the sunlight that filtered through my studio's dusty blinds. My name, Victoria Lane, gleamed in sharp black ink, elegant and unavoidable. Inside lay a gold-foiled invitation to my father's annual charity gala, the event he considered the pinnacle of social respectability. I hadn't attended in years. The last time, I'd stood awkwardly beside him while he introduced me to donors as between jobs, a polite euphemism for failure. I swore that night I wouldn't return until I had a story worth telling. Now, the irony pulsed like a heartbeat in my palm. My company's jingle, the very sound I had created in defiance of his expectations, was scheduled to debut that same evening. At first, I considered declining. My father's parties were a minefield of old judgments and sharper smiles. But as I stared at the invitation, a slow, deliberate calm settled over me. This wasn't just a party. It was an unwitting stage set for a reveal years in the making. I placed the card on my desk beside a stack of client contracts and let the decision bloom quietly. I would go. Not to confront him, not to gloat, but to stand fully in the life I had built without his permission. Preparation became a private ritual. I booked a stylist, something I'd never done before, choosing a midnight blue gown that shimmered like hidden water under moonlight. I wanted elegance without apology, strength without armor. My small team, now 5 fiercely talented creatives, cheered when I told them. They knew about the jingle scheduled debut, but not the personal history entwined with it. "Make sure someone films his face," one designer joked, and we all laughed, though my heart beat faster at the thought. The week leading up to the gala unfolded like a tightly wound overture. Meetings, final client approvals, and late-night rehearsals for the national commercial left me little time to second-guess. Yet in quiet moments, waiting for the subway, brushing my hair before bed, I replayed old memories of past galas. My father's firm handshake as he introduced other people's accomplished children. My own forced smile as I pretended indifference. Each memory sharpened my resolve. I wasn't returning as the timid daughter he once labeled unemployed. I was arriving as the architect of a sound he couldn't escape. On the afternoon of the event, I slipped into the dress and caught my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back carried no trace of the girl who once begged for approval. My hair, swept into a sleek chignon, framed a face lit by something deeper than makeup. Confidence earned in late night work sessions and silent victories. As the car pulled up outside the country club, the evening sky burned with the last streaks of sunset, a warning and a promise. Inside, crystal chandeliers scattered light across polished marble floors, and the air smelled of champagne and old money. Familiar faces turned with polite surprise as I entered, their smiles faltering for a heartbeat as they registered the subtle changes time and independence had carved into me. My father spotted me from across the room, his expression flickering from shock to cautious pride, though he quickly masked it behind a host's practiced warmth. "Victoria," he said, kissing my cheek, "we didn't think you'd make it." I smiled, steady and unreadable. "I wouldn't miss it," I replied, careful to keep the layers of meaning tucked neatly behind my calm tone. Somewhere behind the scenes, the DJ prepared the evening's playlist, my company's jingle, waiting like a fuse, ready to ignite. The party buzzed around us, laughter, clinking glasses, strings of small talk, but beneath it all, I could almost hear the opening notes humming, patient and unstoppable. When the first faint beat finally slipped into the room, threading through the chatter like a secret signal, I felt the future lean forward. The melody was coming, carrying my name in every note, and my father had no idea the sound he'd soon applaud belonged to the daughter he once labeled unemployed. The night had already settled into its glossy rhythm, polite laughter, the soft chime of champagne flutes, the low murmur of power deals whispered over hors d'oeuvres. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, the hem of my midnight blue gown catching fragments of light as the DJ shifted playlists. My father moved easily through the crowd, every handshake a performance, every smile a calculated note in his carefully composed social symphony. My name is Victoria Lane, and in that glittering room, filled with familiar strangers, I felt the weight of every year I had spent building a life no one here believed existed. Then, it happened. A crisp snare tap cracked through the speakers like the first flash of lightning. Heads tilted, conversations faltered. The melody followed, a buoyant, irresistible sequence of notes that seemed to lift the air itself. My melody. The jingle I had written in a cramped apartment lit by a single flickering lamp now swirled across crystal chandeliers and silk gowns, weaving through the chatter like an electric current. A shiver raced down my spine. For months, I'd imagined this moment, but nothing prepared me for the way the sound would own the room. I watched my father from across the floor as recognition flickered across his face. At first, it was simple curiosity, a raised brow, a slight tilt of the head. Then came the dawning realization as he mouthed the brand name that accompanied the tune, a company whose national campaign was making headlines that very week. His eyes narrowed, searching the room for confirmation, as if someone might explain why this wildly successful jingle had found its way into his curated playlist. The DJ, oblivious to the personal earthquake unfolding, pumped the volume higher. Guests began humming along, some even clapping to the beat. My chest swelled with a quiet triumph so sharp it almost hurt. I wanted to laugh, to cry, to shout the truth, but I held my ground, letting the music do what words never could. My father crossed the dance floor, confusion etched into every step. "Isn't this that new Heart Lane campaign?" he asked, leaning close to be heard over the music. His voice carried a mix of admiration and disbelief. I met his gaze, my heart beat a steady drum beneath the melody. "Yes," I said evenly, "it's ours." For a heartbeat, silence wrapped around us, despite the music still thundering through the hall. His eyes searched mine, replaying every phone call where he asked if I'd found a real job, every moment he introduced me as between things. The truth settled over him like a slow sunrise. I saw pride spark behind the shock, a reluctant awe that he struggled to disguise. Around us, the room erupted in cheers as the DJ transitioned seamlessly into a remix, the brand's logo flashing across the LED screens scattered throughout the venue. Phones came out, guests recorded clips, and strangers approached to compliment the genius behind the sound. My father's hand tightened briefly on my arm, a small, wordless acknowledgement that everything he thought he knew had just shifted. I smiled, steady and calm, as years of quiet labor and hidden victories crystallized into a single, unforgettable moment. The melody looped, bright and undeniable, carrying my name in every note, even if no one else yet recognized it. My father finally did. As the applause swelled and the lights pulsed in perfect time with the beat, I whispered a silent promise to myself. This was only the overture. The real symphony, the empire I had built, and the future still unfolding was just beginning, and for the first time, my father was listening. When the last shimmering notes of my jingle faded, the room erupted into a blur of applause, camera flashes, and overlapping conversations. I stood at the center of it all, breathing in the electricity like oxygen. My name is Victoria Lane, and in that glittering instant, the years of hidden work finally stepped into the light. My father still held my arm lightly, as though afraid the music might have been a dream that would slip away if he let go. The DJ segued into a softer track, but the melody still echoed in my mind. Each beat a quiet affirmation. You did this. You built this. He leaned close, his voice low enough to be swallowed by the surrounding cheers. Victoria Hart Lane Creative. The name of my company sounded strange on his tongue, like a foreign phrase he was trying to master. I met his searching eyes and gave a single nod. For a long moment, the man who once introduced me as Unemployed said nothing. Pride, shock, and a flicker of regret crossed his face in quick succession before settling into something almost tender. People began to gather around us, donors, business partners, curious guests, all eager to know more about the music that had stolen the night. My father started to speak, the old instinct to control the narrative sparking in his posture, but I raised a gentle hand. Dad, I said, my voice calm but firm. Let me tell it. For the first time, he stepped back and let me stand fully in the space I had earned. I spoke briefly, explaining how Hart Lane Creative specialized in sonic branding, and how the jingle everyone had just heard was part of a national campaign launching that very week. Cameras clicked, phones recorded, and I could feel my team somewhere in the crowd grinning as the world finally caught up to what we had built in quiet defiance. As I talked, I caught my father watching me with an expression I had never seen before. Pride unclouded by expectation. It was the look I had once begged for and no longer needed. After the formalities, he pulled me aside to a quiet corner near the terrace where the night air smelled of damp grass and distant rain. I misjudged you, he said simply. His voice carried no excuses, only a raw honesty that startled me more than any apology. I thought I was protecting you from disappointment. I didn't see that I was the one holding you back. The words settled over us like a soft chord. Not quite resolution, but something close. I felt no need to gloat or reopen old wounds. The music had already spoken for me in a language neither of us could deny. We stood there for a while, listening to the muffled beat of the party inside, the melody of my making now an indelible part of his carefully curated world. Later, as the crowd thinned and the chandeliers dimmed, I walked out of the country club alone, the night air cool against my skin. My phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from clients and teammates, but I slipped it back into my clutch. I wanted to savor the silence after the storm, the rare stillness that follows a perfect crescendo. That night, I didn't just reclaim my father's respect. I reclaimed my narrative. The girl who once left home with a single duffel bag had returned, not for revenge, but for revelation. My melody had filled the room, but the real music was the life I had composed beat by beat, choice by choice. And as I drove away beneath a sky bright with indifferent stars, I knew this was not an ending. It was the first note of a much larger symphony still waiting to be written. The morning after the gala, the city looked different, brighter, sharper, alive with the low hum of possibility. I woke before sunrise to a phone vibrating endlessly on my nightstand. Emails flooded in like a tide I'd secretly been waiting for. New contracts, interview requests, and invitations from brands eager to work with the agency behind the Jingle. My name is Victoria Lane, and for the first time in my life, I felt the world opening instead of closing. As I sipped coffee by the window of my small office, I replayed the night in my mind. The chandeliers, the stunned faces, the way my father's eyes softened when he finally saw me, not as a daughter to be corrected, but as a force to be reckoned with. The music had carried my truth into every corner of that room, leaving no space for denial. Yet beneath the thrill, I felt something unexpected, a calm resolve. I hadn't built Heartlane Creative to prove him wrong. I had built it to prove myself right. My team arrived one by one, carrying bagels and wide-eyed grins. "We went viral," one of my designers blurted, spinning a laptop toward me. Overnight, clips of the Jingle's surprise debut had racked up millions of views. Comments poured in, some marveling at the music, others at the story behind it once a few guests connected the dots. Heartlane Creative's website nearly crashed under the surge of traffic. I should have felt overwhelmed, but instead, I felt grounded. Every late-night edit, every rejection, every quiet victory had prepared me for this surge. By noon, a national morning show called, asking if I'd share the daughter who stunned her father's gala story on live TV. My team erupted with cheers, but I hesitated. The old me might have jumped at the chance to turn my personal life into a headline. The woman I had become valued something rarer, intentional growth. I agreed to the interview on one condition, that it focus on creative entrepreneurship, not family drama. The producers agreed, though I knew they secretly hoped for a tearful confession. Later that evening, my father called. His voice held a careful mix of pride and humility. "I watched the videos," he said. "Your music is unforgettable. I don't think I've ever been prouder." There was a pause, a quiet inhale. "I'm sorry it took me so long to hear you." I leaned against the window, watching the city's lights flicker like a living constellation. "It's okay, Dad," I said softly. "You hear me now." And for the first time, the words carried no bitterness, only truth. Opportunities kept arriving, partnerships with tech startups, licensing deals with national brands, invitations to keynote conferences. Each offer sparkled with promise, but I chose carefully, determined to protect the creative freedom that had birthed my success. Late at night when the office emptied and the city quieted, I would sit at the keyboard and experiment with new sounds, small melodies that hinted at future campaigns, future moments of revelation. One crisp autumn evening as I left the office after a long brainstorming session, I caught a group of teenagers humming my jingle as they waited for a bus. They didn't know my name, but they carried my music with them, a piece of my story stitched into their day. That was the real victory. Not the viral fame, not even my father's long-delayed recognition, but the quiet proof that something I created in solitude could ripple outward, touching lives I'd never meet. The gala had been a crescendo, but life is not a single performance. It's an endless composition. I walked into that night as a daughter defined by someone else's narrative. I walked out as a composer of my own. The melody continues, and this time, every note is mine. Success, I've learned, doesn't arrive as a final chord. It unfolds like a living score, each movement revealing new harmonies and risks. In the weeks after the gala, the frenzy of phone calls, interviews, and client meetings finally softened into a steady rhythm. My name is Victoria Lane, and as the noise of sudden fame settled, I discovered that the real challenge wasn't winning attention, it was deciding what to do with it. From my office window, I watched autumn peel the city into shades of copper and gold. Heart Lane Creative was thriving beyond anything I once scribbled in late-night journals. We had moved into a larger loft with brick walls and tall windows where morning light painted our desks in streaks of possibility. New hires filled the space with laughter and late-night debates about sound design. Yet, amid the excitement, I reminded myself daily, growth without purpose is just noise. I wanted every campaign to carry intention, every project to echo more than a catchy hook. One afternoon, while reviewing a pitch for a global charity initiative, I felt the first true ripple of what my music could become. The project aimed to create soundscapes for hospitals, gentle, healing audio environments for patients battling long stays and quiet fear. It was a world away from high-energy jingles, but it resonated with the reason I had started all this, to make people feel. I signed the contract on the spot, sensing that this was the next movement of my symphony. My father surprised me by visiting the new office a week later. He stood in the doorway, taking in the exposed beams and buzzing team, the subtle soundtrack playing through hidden speakers. Then for a moment, he looked out of place, an aging patriarch in a room built from rebellion and innovation. Then he smiled, small but genuine. "This is beautiful," he said. "You built all of this." We toured the space together, pausing at the studio where my team layered beats and voices into sonic stories. He listened quietly as I explained our upcoming projects, nodding with an attentiveness I had once begged for and finally earned. Before leaving, he turned to me with a softness I'd never seen. "You've composed a life," he said, "and it's perfect, even if I never imagined it." That night, after the office emptied and the city lights flickered like distant metronomes, I sat at the keyboard that had started everything. My fingers wandered across the keys, finding a melody that felt both familiar and new. A gentle bridge between the girl who left home with a duffel bag and the woman who now shaped soundscapes heard around the world. I recorded it without naming it, letting it exist as a promise to myself. There will always be another song, another chapter, another risk worth taking. I don't know where the next crescendo will come from. Perhaps a hospital corridor soothed by music. Perhaps a campaign that sparks unexpected unity. What I do know is that my life no longer waits for permission or applause. The gala was not an ending. It was an overture. Every beat since has carried me forward. Proof that silence can become symphony when you trust your own sound. As I closed the studio door and stepped into the crisp night air, the city hummed its endless accompaniment. Somewhere in a club or a car or a quiet apartment, someone was still humming my jingle without knowing the name behind it. And that, more than any standing ovation, is the music I will chase for the rest of my life.